Well, hello and welcome to Hey Boomer. My name is Wendy Green and I am your host for Hey Boomer. And continuing with our focus on the family that we've been talking about for this whole month, today we are going to be talking about the wound of estrangement and how it impacts us and affects us. And this is such an important episode because it's a silent hurt that most of us don't talk about, but maybe some of you know someone who is feeling like they're breaking away or their kids are breaking away from them and they really don't know what to do. Point them to this episode. If you can text them right now, they can join us live, or you can share the link later to the podcast, because they're going to learn so much in this episode. We're going to talk about things like why estrangement is on the rise and what has changed in families since we were kids, right? It's a different world now, as you all are aware. And is it possible to heal some of these breaks? And what are some of the cultural influences? And a really interesting question, do therapists that our children may be going to help or hurt in our efforts to restore relationships? So my guest today is Dr. Joshua Coleman, and he's the author of the book, Rules of Estrangement, Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. Dr. Coleman's personal experience with estrangement and subsequent reconciliation adds authenticity to his perspective. I'm going to introduce you to him in a moment, but before I do, I wanted to tell you about two incredible opportunities for you to become actively involved in the Hey Boomer experience and the Hey Boomer community. First, have you joined the Hey Boomer private Facebook group? It's where we get together and we share ideas and we share quotes and we share challenges. Right now we're doing a decluttering challenge in that group. And if you'd like to join the group where, you know, people in our age group are going through a lot of the same changes and questions and rediscovery that you are going through, just go to facebook.com/groups/heyboomer and ask to join, and I'd be happy to let you in. And the second thing I wanted to invite you to is the Boomer Banter. So that is a place where we come together as a group, and it's online, it's virtual, and there's about 25 of us in a room, and I always have a topic, and then we dig into that topic in breakout rooms, and we're building community and we're building friendships. And the banter that I have going now meets on the third Tuesday of every month at 6:30 in the evening Eastern time. That one is closed because we have reached the maximum number of people that allow us to have those intimate conversations and those connections with the people in the group. So I've decided to open a second one. I'm calling it Banter 2, and it's going to meet on the third Tuesday of the month also, but that will be a noontime meeting Eastern time. So, you know, depending on where you are, we have people from all over the country that have joined in the banter, and they really love it. They're getting so much out of it. So go to buymeacoffee.com/heyboomer0413. It's a membership group, so it's very limited in who can be part of it, but I would love to have you help us start this new banter too. So it's buymeacoffee.com/heyboomer0413. All right, so let me introduce you to Dr. Joshua Coleman. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I really am looking forward to this. It's an important episode. Let me just do a brief bio of you. Dr. Coleman is a psychologist in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he's a senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families. He currently writes the Dear Doctor column for Maria Shriver's Sunday paper and has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, MarketWatch, the Huffington Post, Psychology Today, and many more. He's given talks to the faculties at Harvard, the Weill Cornell Department of Psychiatry, Ohio State, and other academic institutions. And he's a frequent guest on many talk shows and podcasts. Dr. Coleman is the author of numerous articles and 4 books. And the book we're going to be talking, or I pulled this episode from today, is The Rules of Estrangement. And it's packed. So thanks for being here, Dr. Coleman.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I wanted to start with your story. You know, like you mentioned in your book the estrangement you had from your daughter and how you healed it. So if you would start filling us in with that.
Sure. Yeah, I was married and divorced in my 20s and have an adult daughter who I'm very close to. But sadly, there was a period of time in her early 20s where she had cut off contact with me for several years, in large part as a result of my remarrying, having children with my current wife, my second wife, and feeling in many ways displaced and kind of unseen. And like the children from my current marriage had a much better quality of life and quality of parenting than she had gotten, which was true. But also feeling like I hadn't really addressed her feelings in a very empathic, responsibility-taking way. And it took me a long time to kind of come to that. And the advice I got from therapists at the time was wrong-headed in the same way that it often is with therapists today, you know, encouraging me to be more assertive and remind her of all I'd done for her and tell her how wrong she was and all those things, which just drove her away even further. So it really wasn't until I started just taking responsibility and being empathic and really finding the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in her complaints, that she began to turn more towards me. And, you know, we began to heal our relationship. So as a result of that, I wrote my first book on the topic in 2007, When Parents Hurt. And as a result of that, got a wide following of estranged parents. And from that, developed a webinar series that I've been doing for the past 12 years or so. Is that right? 2007? I guess my math skills. Probably not. But anyway, for a while. I've also written numerous academic articles on the topic. And as a result of all that, wrote my most recent book, The Rules of Estrangement.
Well, there's so much in there. And I appreciate you being willing to share your story, because that's hard to talk about that pain. And I think it's hard, you know, we were actually talking about this before it came on. It's hard as the parent to accept that responsibility that maybe I did something wrong. I mean, I did my best. I was a good parent, you know, like, right. Why are they so upset?
Yeah. Right, particularly if you were a better parent than your own parents were. I mean, I don't particularly consider that I was, but I think it's particularly hard for those parents who've been raising children in the past few decades who were heroic by almost any other generational standards, and then hearing their children say, "Oh, you emotionally abused me, you traumatized me, you neglected me." And it's human nature, particularly as a parent, to want to defend yourself and prove them wrong and tell them all the ways that you were a great parent. But it doesn't really get you anywhere. By the time your child is saying that, they want a very different kind of conversation with you. And so it's much better for parents to see it from the perspective that the child is bringing to you something that's really important to them. And hopefully it's a way to actually have a deeper, more fulfilling relationship with you. I mean, one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is the cultural changes that have happened in the past half century. And the biggest one is that it's no longer a matter of honor thy mother and thy father in terms of who we choose to be close to in terms of family. It's much more based on, is this relationship make me feel, is it in line with my ideals for my happiness, my identity, my self-esteem, my mental health? And if not, then I don't really want to have that person in my life. So the moral framework has changed, where the moral framework used to be that you should have a relationship with your parents and honor them and give them respect and duty. That's all changed. It's much more now a focus on, is this relationship in line with my ideals? It's what we've evolved, what the British sociologist refers to as pure relationships, so purely constituted on the basis of whether or not the relationship is in line with our ideals. So what that has meant is that it has really compromise parents' ability to influence their children from the position of guilt or obligation or duty. And it has to be much more on the child's terms, which are much more predicated on a far more psychological, egalitarian mental health framework.
There's so much to what you just said. Okay, so if you don't know why your child is so angry with you, how
Yeah.
do you even start that conversation to find out what they're upset about so that you can start to try to make amends?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. What I commonly tell parents to do, which is not always easy for them to do if their child is, cut them off, is to start by saying, I know you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Because from the adult child's perspective, that's how they think and that's how they feel about it. So doing that puts you in alliance with their perspective and their goals, and it also makes them feel less defensive. It makes them
So
feel like,
say that again. Start by saying, I
start by saying,
feel
I know you wouldn't have cut off contact with me unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do.
for you to do. So you're not necessarily saying I was wrong. You're just saying, I understand that you feel this is good for you.
Yeah, but you still have to go on to say, it's clear that I have significant blind spots, that I don't have a deeper understanding of why you need to do this, and I want to know. And if you're open to writing me or telling me more about your thoughts or feelings, I promise to listen to it from the perspective of just listening and learning and not in any way to defending myself. Or if you'd prefer to do it with a family therapist, I would welcome that as well. So it's all,
I,
yeah. Yeah.
Whew, yeah. I mean, family therapy seems to be like if you've gotten to that point, although you do talk about some of the therapy that adult children are getting that may not be helping.
Well, right. Yeah, no, I think therapists are a big problem today. And I think it's probably because therapists don't have a lot of training in estrangement. I think too many therapists are too quick to draw conclusions about a traumatic childhood that really wasn't traumatic. And I think it has to do with what the Israeli sociologist Eva Luz says when she says, today our lives are plotted backwards. What's a dysfunctional family? It's a family where your needs weren't met. How do you know that your needs weren't met? By looking at your present condition. So the wisdom in that is that so many adult children are showing up to therapy with problems with self-esteem, confidence, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, relationship failure, and they're being invited to look back upon their childhoods as the cause of that. Now, sometimes that is the cause of it. Traumas are a real thing. There have been parents who've abused their children, who've molested them, who've neglected them, who were truly emotionally abusive. But not all parents who are being accused of that today were in fact that way. And so it's a faulty set of conclusions and attributions of causality that so many therapists are making today, and it ends up causing a lot of estrangements. Because I commonly see letters from adult children. I'm working with the parents. I know that they're not narcissists or borderlines or sociopaths, and they're saying, "Well, my therapist says that you did this and that proves that you're a narcissist, and therefore, I'm not going to go into therapy with you because narcissists can't change." And that's a really problematic way to.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was divorced, and my parents are the typical, let me be involved and fix everything for you and make you feel guilty that you did this and all of that. And so my therapist suggested that I invite my dad into a meeting with us. And it was really hard for him. He said he felt like he had been thrown into this pool of ice cold water, with the stuff I was saying to him.
Yeah.
But the therapist at least made that suggestion. Let's bring him in. Let's talk to him.
Yeah,
Right.
that's great.
And my dad and I are, we were very close until he passed.
Okay.
But therapists today are not doing that. They're not suggesting, let's talk to the parents too.
Well, certainly some are, but a significant percentage aren't doing it. And when they do conduct family therapy, they're not really prepping the parent. I mean, when I'm going to work with a parent and an adult child, I prep both of them, and I say to the parent, "Look, this isn't marriage therapy. This isn't where where you're going to get to say your piece and what you want out of the relationship, and your adult child's going to say what they want. This is more like you're divorced and your partner is willing to give you another chance, but it's going to be on their terms. That's what you're walking into. So if I'm going to protect anybody's perspective in the therapy, it's going to be your child's perspective, because they're going to be worried I'm going to side with you, A, and B, the estrangement's working for them. For them, it's allied with perspectives and ideals of autonomy, of independence, of protecting their mental health. They've got support from the larger culture, their own therapists. There's a lot of upsides to the adult child for estrangement. There's no upside for the parent. For the parent, it's all grief, it's all sorrow, it's all guilt, it's all regret, it's all social isolation, it's all shame. So there's this enormous disparity in who has the power. So therapists have to walk in with their eyes open about that and tell the parent that. And I also will tell the adult child that as well. I'll say, look, the goal here is for you to talk about what your complaints are about your parent, for me to help your parent take responsibility and show empathy towards you, be open to your ideals about boundaries and limit setting, etc. And I'll say at the beginning of the therapy that people need to talk to each other respectfully. So it's not like I'm just going to let the adult child come in there and just blast the parent in the way that I might have earlier before I really became, more focused on this topic. So both sides are prepared, and I just don't think a family therapy session can be successful unless therapists have that orientation of this huge disparity in who has the power.
Mm. So you mentioned shame, and that is a big reason you call this the silent epidemic, and the numbers are going up, as you say. So what's the trajectory? Like, a parent suddenly is feeling estranged from their child. Do they talk to friends about it first? Should they try and guilt their child into coming back? Do they go to therapy first? Do they find like your website? I mean, what do you find is the way? Because they're so ashamed and hurt, they don't really want to talk about it.
Right. Well, I think parents do a number of different things. I have a webinar coming up actually tomorrow night that's free. I don't know if for people who are listening in live, called The 5 Most Common Mistakes of Estranged Parents. And I wrote it, first of all, the mistakes that I made and virtually every other estranged parent makes. And that is, once an estrangement starts to get triggered, you make a bunch of mistakes just kind of out of your basic survival instinct. So the first one is the notion of fairness versus being sort of strategic, because from the parent's perspective, it isn't fair what the adult child is doing to them. They just feel very wounded and misunderstood, but they have to be more mindful and thoughtful about what they're going to communicate. Second common mistake is to use guilt, because guilt doesn't really work anymore. I thought for the longest time I'm Jewish about writing an article called The Last Jewish Mother, because, in our generation, Wendy, our mothers could guilt trip us, but as an expression of affection. They could say, well, my mother might teasingly, she wasn't a super guilt trippy person, but she might occasionally tease me and go, okay, Mr. Fancy Psychologist in San Francisco, can't be too good to call you mother now.
Yes, I do know that Jewish guilt. Yes.
There's Italian guilt. There's probably guilt for almost.
There's Catholic guilt.
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
all, right.
We don't hold the corner on it, but we probably developed it into an art form more than anything. But that's been taken out of parents' hands. That's considered coercive. It's considered manipulative, emotionally abusive. It's not in line with the child's ideals about that they get to set the terms of the relationship. So that's guilt mistake number 2. Shall I go on?
Yeah, please. This is great. Oh, before you do, though, let me say they can find this webinar on your website, right? drjoshuacoleman.com.
Right.
Okay, so they can find the webinar there.
Yeah. And it's free for at least the next few days. It'll be free.
Okay.
So the third common mistake is returning fire with fire, which I think fathers in particularly are inclined to do. It's kind of like, how you ungrateful brat, after everything I did for you and put you through college and helped you buy a house and paying for your kids' private, whatever, right? You want me to apologize to you, you can apologize to me. So that's returning fire with fire. That does absolutely no good. Fourth common mistake is not seeing that estrangement, reconciliation is a marathon, not a sprint. By the time there's been an estrangement, it's not going to probably can't just move one or two things on the table and expect it to just happen overnight. The fifth common mistake is not seeing that it may not be about you, that a certain percentage of estrangements are more about the adult child finding their own voice, feeling separate, developing their own identity, and they may not be able to do it with you kind of psychologically in the room. One of the problems that's happened, I think, in the past 3 or 4 decades, particularly with cell phones and parents becoming much more anxious and intrusive and surveilling, is that our children in some ways have gotten too much of us, and they still can get too much of us. And when I moved out to San Francisco from Dayton, Ohio, when I was 21, I probably didn't call my parents from the road. Maybe I called them after I got here, and it took me like a week to get out, or maybe I called them a week after that, or maybe I sent an occasional letter. But it was much easier to become your own person in a more organic way, without your parent kind of constantly circling and
now they track them on their phone.
Well, right, exactly, right.
They do.
And parents feel much more wounded if they don't get a text right away. So all of that has really kind of made things much more crowded. There's the good news is that it provides opportunities for much more closeness and involvement and picture sharing and the like, but it also provides the opportunities for much more intrusion and enmeshment in ways that.
If you're interested in hearing more about building stronger relationships with adult children, you should check out the podcast, Bite Your Tongue, the podcast. They talk about everything from weddings and divorce to trouble with in-laws, mother-daughter relationships, even disrespectful adult children. And they talk about all of this from various perspectives. I love the show. I strongly encourage you to go listen to Bite Your Tongue, the podcast, on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Isn't necessarily in the best interest of either parent or adult child.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. My children have the oldest is in college now, right? Mm-hmm. And they've been that helicopter parenting and tracking and all. It's going to be interesting to see as these kids start to move out and try to develop their own personalities, if they struggle with some of that too.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's to look forward to, Wendy.
Something to look forward to. Thank you. So learning to be a parent of adult children, it can be difficult. And I know that, I've watched my relationship with my kids shift over time, especially once they got married, and I love their spouses. Like, I know that's a big problem too.
Can be, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But you still, and as I would self-justify, it's like, okay, it's normal. They should be more talking to their spouse than talking to me. Oh, but they always talk to me,
Right.
So how much of our expectations of what we want the relationship to be becomes a problem?
Yeah, it definitely can become a problem when children get married. And in my survey of 1,600 estranged parents that I did through the University of Wisconsin, I found that something like 70% of the estrangements happened after the child had gotten married. So,
wow.
Yeah, so it just, it's a matter of bringing somebody new in, the parents' decreasing role of importance in just the way that you're describing. And a lot of parents, mismanage that for obvious reasons. Our first of all, our expectations of closeness for our adult children are much higher than they were in, say, our parents' generation.
So much higher. Yes, for sure.
Expect children to be like our best friends, and our parents didn't really particularly. I was very close to my parents. I was very blessed with having parents that I probably would have chosen as friends, but I don't think it was their expectation, that we would be besties or something. But our generation really has grown up feeling like that, and that's continued with younger generations of parents as well. So again, it's nice work if you can get it, but if it isn't really in line with your child's ideals, then that can be a problem, because then if you're complaining about it, then your child might push away even more, because then it's kind of like, well, you're making me feel guilty. You're not accepting my own ideals about how much closeness I want. You're making me feel like I'm a bad son or a bad daughter to not be as available as you want me to be. And all of those things can really hurt the relationship with the parent. And that can, if poorly applied or misapplied, lead to an eventual estrangement. I mean, what's the biggest word that I see in every single letter from an estranged adult child? You need to respect my boundaries. Boundaries is the biggest word. And it's partly because of what we're talking about right now, that we have become much more enmeshed with our adult children. I mean, in our generation, fathers in particular, if they made any mistakes, was that they weren't involved enough. And mothers were involved. My mother, I don't know about yours, but she played bridge, she played mahjong with her girlfriends. My parents they went on the weekends. They didn't call it date nights, but they had regular weekend, time. They had close friends. But our generation, we were much more just put it all into our children. And every generation
That's right.
has done that. And so the family environment has just become much more enmeshed. And some adult children just are estranged because they just got too much of the parent. And they don't know any other way to feel separate. So.
Well, I do remember when I was living in Nashville, I learned this concept called your family of choice,
Right.
which I thought was lovely. My friends, they care about me. They're right. I wouldn't choose some of the people that are in my family, but they're my family. And in my generation, the way I was raised, you still maintain a relationship, right? They're my family.
Yeah.
And I guess what we're seeing now and what you're saying is that children in our children, Gen X and millennials, they are more likely to say, this is about me and my happiness and my well-being, and being too close to you is making that difficult. So I'm choosing not to. Is that what you're saying?
I am. Yeah. That happiness, and in particular, preservation of mental health, is also the new moral order. If somebody, in some ways, you view them from a younger generation's perspective as being in some ways harmful to your mental health, then not only can you cut them out of your life, but you should cut them out of your life. In some ways, that's being an act of existential courage. Whereas in our generation, it's like, first of all, we didn't expect to be besties with our parents. They didn't expect to be besties with us. And we sort of assumed that a certain amount of conflict was normal and expectable. And we didn't feel like we had to kind of like everything that they did. I mean, what so many estranged parents say to me today is like, my parents were crappy in many ways, but I still would have never dreamed of cutting them off. Whereas parents today are getting cut off for things which are far less severe than they might have been in earlier generations. But it's partly because there's such a emphasis and preoccupation on happiness and mental health and self-growth and self-development. And there's this idea that if anybody interferes with that, then not only can you cut them off, but somehow you should cut them off, which I think is highly problematic.
Yeah. So two questions. You're not downplaying the fact that there is a mental health crisis among our teens, are you?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. And then the other question is, as Myrna asks here, what about the mental health of the parent? What is the child's responsibility to be more empathetic towards the parent?
Well, I wish that there was a greater responsibility, but I just don't think that. I think that there should be a responsibility from the part on the adult child to be much more mindful of how they're impacting the parent by cutting them off. I mean, the parents in my practice who've been cut off, they're miserable. They're heartbroken. They're depressed. They're anxious. They're enraged. They feel guilty. They feel ashamed. They feel socially isolated. They feel like they can't talk about it with anybody. And I don't really like how our culture has made it seem like, that's somehow a worthwhile cost of the adult child pursuing their mental health. Now, that said, obviously, I can't support a reconciliation if a parent isn't willing to do some of the basics towards repair, respecting the adult child's limits. If a parent feels like they can demand a relationship with the adult child, but also feel like they can continue to, be humiliating of them or shaming or rejecting or critical or hostile to them or abusive, well, then it's hard for me to support a reconciliation under those circumstances. But if a parent is willing to do, to make repairs, to take responsibility, to show empathy and compassion towards the adult child, to find the kernel, if not the bristle, of truth in the child's complaints, then I wish more adult children would take that olive branch. But a lot of them aren't, despite the parents' good efforts, because I see them every day in my practice.
So what are the steps a parent should take to try and build that bridge with
Yeah.
the
Well, the first is my favorite thing, or I think the most effective thing, is to write a letter of amends. I think typically over email is best because it's just more informal. And in the letter of amends, you try to address the kernel of truth in the child's complaints. Now, part of what's challenging for parents is the way that labels like emotional abuse, harm, neglect, and trauma have transformed over the past 3 or 4 decades. This is based on the research of Nick Haslam, an Australian psychologist. So things that are now considered that way, and our generation would not have been considered that way. So many
Mhm.
parents say, what emotional abuse? What are you talking about? Traumatizing you? Had a freaking, I would kill to have your childhood. But that's not going to get the parent anywhere. A lot of parents feel like, oh, no, you want to know who had an emotionally abusive childhood? I had an emotionally abusive childhood. This was a freaking walk in the park. Give me a break. But as you can imagine, that's not going to get the adult child to open up the door.
No.
No. So instead, the parent has to show empathy and take responsibility. So in the amends letter, I do recommend the parents start the way that I was saying earlier, which is I know you wouldn't have cut off contact unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. If there are things that they recognize were problematic, then they should address those in a very straightforward way. I know the divorce was hard on you, or I know that I can be critical, even if you don't feel like you're critical all the time, and that was difficult for you and that impacted you perhaps much more than I realized. Phrases like emotionally abusive or neglect or any of those things, you still have to find a way to address that. So what I encourage parents to say is something like, it's clear that I have blind spots, that I didn't know that was emotionally abusive to you, but I'm glad that you let me know. I would love to learn more about that. If you have other memories about that you want to talk over with me or do family therapy around, I'm happy to. Or if there are things you'd like me to be working on in my own therapy, again, therapy, because that is the culture of the younger generations. So those are the main things that are in the amends letters, but no explanation, no defending. Can say, well, I was a single mother. Well, your mother
I did
poisoned.
the best I knew how to do.
I could, exactly. I mean, it's true, but it's just not for the letter. It's what I call the distinction between self-dialogue and the dialogue with your parents. You can tell yourself, yeah, well, you were a difficult kid. Yeah, well, your wife doesn't like me, so she poisoned you against me. Or yeah, your mother hated me, or your father hated me, and that ruined our relationship. Or you're a mentally ill kid. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can say to yourself. You just don't say them to your child. Your child is just purely empathy and love and compassion and responsibility. So yeah, no, it's
Boy,
not
that's got to be really hard to
it's
do.
really
And
hard.
I don't know that I could do that without the help of a therapist because, like
Sure.
you said, you're wounded already.
Right.
And now you're
Right.
saying, I I didn't know, I didn't mean, you don't even say I didn't mean to hurt you.
Right.
You
That's right.
know?
It's true. You don't even say that. Right. I
You don't
agree.
even say that. Whew.
Yeah.
Wow,
It's
that's
it's
tough.
it's a tall order. And a lot of parents will write me and they're mad. And well, they should be apologizing to me. And you're making parents do all the work. And I'm like, yeah, I get it, but you're not going to have a relationship with your kid otherwise. They've already decided it's better for them to not have you in their life. So I can rail against them all you want, but it's not going to get your kid back in your life.
And I want to talk about grandparenting, because that's the generation that's listening today.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I I mean, I read all the books. I thought I was a good parent, and I mean, even simple stuff, right? We put our babies down on their tummies. And then it was like, no, no, put their babies down on their backs.
Right. Yeah.
So much has changed in
Mhm.
the way you parent today
Yeah.
that I find that even my kids will say to me sometimes, and these are teenagers now, Mom, you probably don't want to say it like that. You know? Like,
Thanks, kid.
relationship with these grandkids, don't tell me how to be.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But that's got, I mean, is there anything a grandparent can do if they've been cut off from the grandchildren?
Well, the reality is that grandchildren are often a casualty and collateral damage of the estrangement with the adult child. I mean, tragically, very dedicated, loving grandparents, even by the child's own admission, can be the adult child's admission can be they're a common casualty of estrangement, often justified by, well, if it's not good for me, it's not good for my children, which I think is crap. But it is a common kind of a thing that's said. So no, I mean, again, it's, a lot of parents feel like, well, okay, well, you don't want to have me in your life, but how about me having contact with my grandchildren? And it's very rare that the adult child will go along with that. So it has to be healed through the relationship with the adult child rather than with the grandchild. But I mean, I do encourage parents, unless they're having gifts sent back, to continue to try to stay connected to the grandchildren through gifts, or, if texting is allowed, then certainly that, but often that gets cut off too.
That's got to be heartbreaking.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
What about situations where, you have the two parents and the adult child has decided I'm cutting off one of them, but I'll talk to the other one?
Yeah.
Oh, that puts that other parent right in the middle.
Yeah. No, it's not the most common thing to happen, but it's common enough. And what I tell parents in that situation is parents often feel like they have to be united front, understandably so. But it's usually a mistake from a reconciliation perspective. It's far better for the non-estranged parent. Well, let me back up. It's better for the estranged parent to give permission for the non-estranged parent to stay in connection, because the fewer degrees of separation, the better that parent can kind of hear more about what the complaints are. If they don't go along with it, then they'll assume that the estranged parent is manipulating that person towards not being in contact with the estranged adult child. But what I commonly tell the non-estranged parent to say is something like, look, your mother or your father is in support of my continuing to see you. They are in a lot of pain about not having you in their life. They are willing, assuming they are, to do their own therapy or to do family therapy. And I think that's kind of, in any family relationship, the gold standard. If the person's willing to take responsibility, be self-reflective, and engage in therapy, then, it's something that I hope that you will be willing to do. If not now, then at some other point. And if there's room to say it, to say, whatever your other parents' flaws were, they also contributed a lot to your life in the following, in these ways. But
so you're saying for the parent that's still communicating, they can make some of those excuses. Your parent was there for you. He went to karate with you. He paid for your college, whatever. You can say that as the parent that's still in communication.
You can say it once or twice a year.
Okay.
Yeah. You can't be there to defend the other parent, or you'll lose the adult. You'll become the second estranged parent. It's just something you can periodically say, just as a position of advocacy. But the parent who's estranged may want you to be in that kind of a position permanently, well, you need to tell them that I'm, in a lot of pain, and this is hard on me, and they should do family therapy, and, that it just doesn't work. So, but I find that to be the most effective way to manage that.
But I like that suggestion to say, your parent is in support of me talking to you.
Right.
And they are hurting, and they hope that this can be resolved, but at least we're still talking.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. That's a good one. So do you think estrangements run in families? Like, is it?
There's some evidence for that in the research that I've done. If the parent was estranged from their own parents, there's a bigger chance that they'll be estranged themselves. And it could be a matter of role modeling. It could be the intergenerational nature of trauma. But there is a bigger chance of that.
Yeah. So how are the numbers showing that this is becoming a silent epidemic, as you say?
Well, today, 1 out of 4 fathers is estranged from a
1
child.
out of 4?
Yeah.
Of the fathers, and those are mostly fathers in the boomer generation?
Yeah, boomers and Gen X. Yeah. And particularly from daughters, the father-daughter relationship is the most vulnerable. On the mother's side, depending on which study you read, is somewhere between 6% and 12% of mothers are estranged. So we don't really have a good records in terms of, it's a relatively new area of research. So, but it's clear to every psychologist I ever talked to that, and just look at how much it's in the media. It's on the media all the time. When I wrote my first book on the topic in 2007, I was in the media, I was on the Today Show and a number of other interviews. But now it's like, there's probably a day that doesn't go by that there's not some new article or interview or broadcast about it. So I think it's becoming a really serious problem.
So here's another question. If you've written a letter and your child won't respond, or what is it? Do you write another letter? What do you do then?
Yeah, well, what I recommend is you write the letter according to my guidelines, because they're not easy letters to write. And I have a webinar on how to write amends, because it is really complicated. I talk about it in the book as well.
You do, yeah. Some of the examples in the book, I just read them and I was hurting just reading them. That'd be hard to do.
Really hard to do. So I recommend writing a really good letter and then waiting 6 to 8 weeks. If you get no response, then writing a follow-up letter that just says, hey, just checking in, wanted to see if you had a chance to read my letter. I'm sure there are things in it that I left out that would have been good to have concluded, but I mostly wanted to just see if there was a way to get a conversation started with you. Again, I'm open to any feedback if you have, and promise to listen purely from the perspective of learning and not in any way to defend myself, love mom, dad, etc. Now, depending on the child, for some adult children, I might still reach out, maybe once a month or something, chatty, neutral, non-relationship oriented, just to kind of keep the line open, even if the child isn't responding. But for others, particularly those who seem more hostile, in that case, if you get nothing back after the second, then I would let the line go cold, meaning I wouldn't do anything. And I do it for at least a year, which is hard for parents to do, mothers in particular. And the reason for that is that there's a number of reasons why that can work. One is that your child may feel like you're respecting their limits more, even if you don't agree with them. Second of all, they may respect you more, kind of like, well, you're not just still continuing to throw good energy after bad. Third is that it causes them it invites more self-reflection. So if the parent hasn't written for 6 months and they're used to write every other week or something, then the adult child has to say to themselves, oh, it's my parent hasn't written me. Oh, that's right, I haven't written them, or I told them I didn't want to be in contact. So it invites a more of an internal self-reflective process that doesn't happen if the parent is continuing to circle overhead. Fourth, that saying, how can I miss you if you never go away, is also true in families. Sometimes if the parent just does kind of disappear for a while, then the adult child has more time and space to miss them and to think about them. The fifth reason is that, it's what I call lose your parent, find yourself. For some adult children, they just need to have the parent completely out of their mind in order to sort of feel like they're coming back to the parent, not because of guilt, but out of their own volition. So there's a bunch of different reasons why just letting the line go completely cold for a year or so works. Now, it's hard for parents to do, as I said, mothers in particular, but sometimes it's the best thing to do.
Yeah. Well, this is not an easy topic, Dr. Coleman. And, what you have shared with us has really been helpful.
Okay.
Requires so much empathy, self-reflection on our own parts. And I think knowing our why, like, why do you want this relationship, and what are you willing to do to make that happen?
Right, exactly. And not getting into the fairness, unfairness of it, just sort of accepting it. The rules have changed, and these are the new rules that you either can play or not play, but there's not a third option.
Yeah. Well, if you want to reach out to Dr. Coleman and see some of the webinars, and he's got trainings and he's got all kinds of resources on his website, it's www.dr for Dr. JoshuaColeman.com. So that's drjoshuacoleman.com. So go check that out. Before I let you go, I love sharing what I hear from my listeners. So I really appreciate that you guys go and take the time to make comments on Spotify or Apple. And so I just wanted to let you know, on one of the episodes with Dr. Bernstein, the one about long, healthy, fulfilling life, a listener said it was a great show. And on the episode about brain health with Dr. Crystal Culler, a listener said she loved it. There was so much useful information. So keep those comments coming. They help me know that I'm hitting the right information that y'all are interested in. Okay, so don't miss the opportunity to become part of the second Boomer Banter. Go and join the membership at buymeacoffee.com/heyboomer0413. We will be starting that on the third Tuesday of October. Our topic for that will be role models. So that should be an interesting conversation. And then go and join our Facebook group. Just that doesn't cost you anything. That's just fun place to be. So it's facebook.com/groups/heyboomer. And who are we talking to next week? We're going to do one more week on family. And my guest next week is Kim Best. And she's going to be talking to us about those end of life conversations, which can be difficult conversations, but they also don't have to be difficult conversations if you handle them in a loving and compassionate way. And we're going to talk about how you can create the legacy that you want to have left behind. So Kim is an RN. She spent a lot of time working in the ER and the ICU, working with hospice. So I think that this is going to be a very helpful conversation and another very important conversation. And I always like to leave you with the belief that we can all live with curiosity, live with relevance, and live with courage. And remember that you are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. My name is Wendy Green. Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
Thanks for having me.
And this has been Hey Boomer.